a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Beslan School Siege. The Beslan school siege started on the 1st of September 2004, lasted 3 days, involved the illegal imprisonment of over 2,100 people as hostages, and ended with the deaths of at least 334 people. The crisis began when a group of armed Islamic militants, mostly Ingush and Chechen, occupied School No. 1 in the town of Beslan, North Ossetia on the 1st of September 2004. The hostage-takers were the Riyadus-Salikhin Battalion, sent by the Chechen warlord Shamil Basayev, who demanded recognition of the independence of Chechnya and Russian withdrawal from Chechnya. On the third day of the standoff, Russian security forces stormed the building with the use of tanks, incendiary rockets and other heavy weapons. As of December 2006, 334 people were killed, including 186 children. The event led to security and political repercussions in Russia. Most notably, it contributed to a series of federal government reforms consolidating power in the Kremlin and strengthening of the powers of the President of Russia. As of 2016, aspects of the crisis in relation to the militants continue to be contentious. Questions remain regarding how many terrorists were involved, the nature of their preparations, and whether a section of the group had escaped. Questions about the Russian government's management of the crisis have also persisted, including allegations of disinformation and censorship in news media, whether the journalists who were present at Beslan were allowed to freely report on the crisis, the nature and content of negotiations with the terrorists, allocation of responsibility for the eventual outcome, and perceptions that excessive force was used. The European Court of Human Rights in a 2017 ruling criticized Russia for not taking sufficient precautions before the event, and for using excessive lethal force when concluding the siege, which violated the right to life. Background: School No. 1 was one of 7 schools in Beslan, a town of around 35,000 people in the Republic of North Ossetia-Alania, in Russia's Caucasus. The school, located next to the district police station, had around 60 teachers and more than 800 students. Its gymnasium, where most of the hostages were held for 52 hours, was a recent addition, measuring 10 meters wide and 25 meters long. There were reports that men disguised as repairmen had concealed weapons and explosives in the school sometime during July 2004, something the authorities later denied. However, several witnesses have since testified they were made to help their captors remove the weapons from the caches hidden in the school. There were also claims that a sniper's nest on the sports hall roof had been set up in advance. Day 1. The attack on the school took place in 2004 on the 1st of September, the traditional start of the Russian school year, referred to as First Bell or Knowledge Day. On this day, the children, accompanied by their parents and other relatives, attend ceremonies hosted by their school. Because of the Knowledge Day festivities, the number of people in the schools was considerably higher than on a normal school day. Early in the morning, a group of several dozen heavily armed Islamic nationalist guerrillas left a forest encampment located in the vicinity of the village of Stakhin, the neighboring Republic of Ingushetia, east of North Ossetia and west of war-torn Chechnya. The terrorists wore green military camouflage and black balaclava masks, and in some cases were also wearing explosive belts and explosive underwear. On the way to Beslan, on a country road near the North Ossetian village of Kurakau, they captured an Ingush police officer, Major Sultan Gahev. Gahev escaped after reaching the town and went to the district police department to inform them that his duty handgun and badge were taken away. At 9:11 local time, the terrorists arrived at Beslan in a GAZL police van and a Gaz-66 military truck. Many witnesses and independent experts claim that there were, in fact, 2 groups of attackers, and that the first group was already at the school when the second group arrived by truck. At first, some at the school mistook the guerrillas for Russian special forces practicing a security drill. However, the attackers soon began shooting in the air and forcing everybody from the school grounds into the building. During the initial chaos, up to 50 people managed to flee and alert authorities to the situation. A number of people also managed to hide in the boiler room. After an exchange of gunfire against the police and an armed local civilian, in which reportedly one attacker was killed and 2 were wounded. The militants seized the school building. Reports of the death toll from this shootout range from 2 to 8 people, while more than a dozen people were injured. The attackers took approximately 1,100 hostages. The number of hostages was initially downplayed by the government to 200-400, and then for an unknown reason announced to be exactly 354. In 2005, their number was put at 1,128. The militants herded their captives into the school's gym and confiscated all their mobile phones under threat of death, and ordered everyone to speak in Russian and only when spoken to. When a father named Ruslan Betrosov stood to calm people and repeat the rules in the local language, Ossetic, a gunman approached him, asked Betrosov if he was done, and then shot him in the head. Another father named Vadim Boloyev, who refused to kneel, was also shot by a captor and then bled to death. Their bodies were dragged from the sports hall, leaving a trail of blood later visible in the video made by the hostage takers. After gathering the hostages in the gym, the attackers singled out 15-20 of whom they thought were the strongest adults among the male teachers, school employees, and fathers, and took them into a corridor next to the cafeteria on the second floor, where a deadly blast soon took place. An explosive belt on one of the female bombers detonated, killing another female bomber and several of the selected hostages, as well as mortally injuring one male hostage taker. According to the version presented by the surviving hostage taker, the blast was actually triggered by the polkovnik. He set off the bomb by remote control to kill those who openly disagreed about the child hostages and intimidate other possible dissenters. The hostages from this group who were still alive were then ordered to lie down and shot with an automatic rifle by another gunman. All but one of them were killed. Kaon Mrads, the Alania football team's cameraman, survived the explosion as well as the shooting. When discovered to be still alive, he was allowed to return to the sports hall, where he lost consciousness. The militants then forced other hostages to throw the bodies out of the building and to wash the blood off the floor. One of these hostages, Aslan Kutsayev, escaped by jumping out the window. The authorities briefly detained him as a suspected hostage taker. Beginning of the siege. A security cordon was soon established around the school, consisting of the Russian police, internal troops, and Russian army forces, Spetsnaz, including the elite Alpha and Vimpel units of the Russian Federal Security Service, and the Oman special units of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs. A line of 3 apartment buildings facing the school gym was evacuated and taken over by the special forces. The perimeter they made was within 225 meters of the school, inside the range of the militants' grenade launchers. No firefighting equipment was in position and, despite the previous experiences of the 2002 Moscow theater hostage crisis, there were few ambulances ready. The chaos was worsened by the presence of Ossetian volunteer militiamen and armed civilians among the crowds of relatives who had gathered at the scene. There were perhaps as many as 5,000 of them. The attackers mined the gym and the rest of the building with improvised explosive devices, and surrounded it with tripwires. In a further bid to deter rescue attempts, they threatened to kill 50 hostages for every one of their own members killed by the police, and to kill 20 hostages for every gunman injured. They also threatened to blow up the school if government forces attacked. To avoid being overwhelmed by gas attack like their comrades in the 2002 Moscow hostage crisis, insurgents quickly smashed the school's windows. The captors prevented hostages from eating and drinking until North Ossetia's President Alexander Dzhissarov would arrive to negotiate with them. However, the FSB set up their own crisis headquarters from which Dzhissarov was excluded, and threatened to arrest him if he tried to go to the school. The Russian government announced that it would not use force to rescue the hostages, and negotiations towards a peaceful resolution took place on the first and second days, at first led by Leonid Rushel, a pediatrician whom the hostage takers had reportedly asked for by name. However, a witness statement in the court indicated that the Russian negotiators confused Rushel with Vladimir Rushailo, a Russian security official. According to Savalayev's report, the official headquarters was looking for a peaceful resolution of the situation at the same time when the secret headquarters set up by the FSB was preparing the assault. Savalayev wrote that in many ways the heavies restricted the actions of the civilians, in particular in their attempts to negotiate with the militants. At Russia's request, a special meeting of the United Nations Security Council was convened on the evening of the 1st of September, at which the council members demanded the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages of the terrorist attack. U.S. President George W. Bush made a statement offering support in any form to Russia. Day 2. On September 2, 2004, negotiations between Russia and the hostage-takers proved unsuccessful, and they refused to allow food, water, or medicine to be taken in for the hostages, or for the dead bodies to be removed from the front of the school. At noon, FSB First Deputy Director, Colonel General Vladimir Pronichev showed Zisuhov a decree signed by Prime Minister Mikhail Fradkov appointing North Ossetia FSB Chief Major General Valery Andreev as head of the operational headquarters. In April 2005, however, a Moscow news journalist received photocopies of the interview protocols of Zisuhov and Andreev by investigators, revealing that two headquarters had been formed in Beslan, a formal one, upon which was laid all responsibility, and a secret one, which made the real decisions, and at which Andreev had never been in charge. The Russian government downplayed the numbers, repeatedly stating there were only 354 hostages. This reportedly angered the hostage-takers, who further mistreated their captives. Several officials also said there appeared to be only 15 to 20 militants in the school. The crisis was met with a near-total silence from then-President of Russia Vladimir Putin and the rest of Russia's political leaders. Only on the second day did Putin make his first public comment on the siege during a meeting in Moscow with King Abdullah II of Jordan. Our main task, of course, is to save the lives and health of those who became hostages. All actions by our forces involved in rescuing the hostages will be dedicated exclusively to this task. It was the only public statement by Putin about the crisis until one day after its bloody end. In protest, several people at the scene raised signs reading, "Putin, release our children," "Meet their demands," and "Putin, there are at least 800 hostages." The locals also said they would not allow any storming or poisoning of their children. In the afternoon, the gunmen allowed Ruslan Ossetia, respected ex-president of Ingushetia and retired Soviet Army general, to enter the school building and agreed to release 11 nursing women and all 15 babies personally to him. The women's older children were left behind and one mother refused to leave, so Ossetia carried out her child instead. The rebels gave Ossetia a videotape made in the school and a note with demands from their purported leader, Shamil Basayev, who was not himself present in Beslan. The existence of the note was kept secret by the Russian authorities, while the tape was declared as being empty. It was falsely announced that the hostage-takers made no demands. In the note, Basayev demanded recognition of a formal independence for Chechnya, in the frame of the Commonwealth of Independent States. He also said that although the Chechen separatists had played no part in the Russian apartment bombings of 1999, they would now publicly take responsibility for them if needed. Some Russian officials and state-controlled media later attacked Ossetia for entering the school, accusing him of colluding with the hostage-takers. The lack of food and water took its toll on the young children, many of whom were forced to stand for long periods in the hot, tightly packed gym. Many children took off their clothing because of the sweltering heat within the gymnasium, which led to rumors of sexual impropriety. Though the hostages later explained it was merely due to the stifling heat and being denied any water. Many children fainted, and parents feared they would die. Some hostages drank their own urine. Occasionally, the militants took out some of the unconscious children and poured water on their heads before returning them to the sports hall. Later in the day, some adults also started to faint from fatigue and thirst because of the conditions in the gym. When the explosion and gun battle began on the third day, many of the surviving children were so fatigued that they were barely able to flee from the carnage. At around 15:30, 2 grenades were detonated approximately 10 minutes apart by the militants at security forces outside the school, setting a police car on fire and injuring one officer, but Russian forces did not return fire. As the day and night wore on, the combination of stress and sleep deprivation, and possibly drug withdrawal, made the hostage-takers increasingly hysterical and unpredictable. The crying of the children irritated them, and on several occasions crying children and their mothers were threatened with being shot if they would not stop crying. Russian authorities claimed that the hostage-takers had listened to German heavy metal group Rammstein on personal stereos during the siege to keep themselves edgy and fired up. Overnight, a police officer was injured by shots fired from the school. Talks were broken off, resuming the next day. Day 3. Early on the third day, Ruslan Ossetia, Alexander Dzassohov, Teimuraz Mansurov, and First Deputy Chairman Israel Totunti together made contact with President of the Chechen Republic of Korea, Aslan Maskhadov. Totunti said that both Maskhadov and his western-based emissary Zakayev declared they were ready to fly to Beslan to negotiate with the militants, which was later confirmed by Zakayev. Totunti said that Maskhadov's sole demand was his unbinded passage to the school. However, the assault began 1 hour after the agreement on his arrival was made. He also mentioned that journalists from Al Jazeera television offered for 3 days to participate in the negotiations and enter the school even as hostages, but their services were not needed by anyone. Russian presidential advisor and former police general, an ethnic Chechen Islam Basayev, was also said to be close to breakthrough in the secret negotiations. By the time he left Moscow on the second day, Basayev had accumulated the names of more than 700 well-known Russian figures who were volunteering to enter the school as hostages in exchange for the release of children. Basayev said the hostage-takers agreed to allow him to enter the school the next day at 1500 hours. However, the storming had begun 2 hours before. The first explosions and the fire in the gymnasium. Around 1300 hours on 3 September 2004, it was agreed to allow 4 Ministry of Emergency Situations medical workers in 2 ambulances to remove 20 bodies from the school grounds, as well as to bring the corpse of the killed terrorist to the school. However, at 13:03, when the paramedics approached the school, an explosion was heard from the gymnasium. The hostage-takers then opened fire on them, killing 2. The other 2 took cover behind their vehicle. The second, strange-sounding, explosion was heard 22 seconds later. At 13:05 the fire on the roof of the sports hall started and soon the burning rafters and roofing fell onto the hostages below, many of them injured, but still living. Eventually, the entire roof collapsed, turning the room into an inferno. The flames reportedly killed some 160 people. There are several widely conflicting versions regarding the source and nature of the explosions. Storming by Russian forces. Part of the sports hall wall was demolished by the explosions, allowing some hostages to escape. Local militia opened fire, and the militants returned fire. A number of people were killed in the crossfire. Russian officials say militants shot hostages as they ran, and the military fired back. The government asserts that once the shooting started, troops had no choice but to storm the building. However, some accounts from the town's residents have contradicted that official version of events. Police Lieutenant Colonel Elbrus Nogayev, whose wife and daughter died in the school, said, "I heard a command saying, 'Stop shooting. Stop shooting,' while other troops' radios said, 'Attack.'" As the fighting began, an oil company president and negotiator Mikhail Gutseriev phoned the hostage-takers. He heard, "You tricked us," in answer. 5 hours later, Gutseriev and his interlocutor reportedly had their last conversation, during which the man said, "The blame is yours and the Kremlin's." According to Torshin, the order to start the operation was given by the head of the North Ossetian FSB Valery Andreev. However, statements by both Andreev and Dzassohov indicated that it was FSB Deputy Directors Vladimir Pronichev and Vladimir Anisimov who were actually in charge of the Beslan operation. General Andreev also told North Ossetia's Supreme Court that the decision to use heavy weapons during the assault was made by the head of the FSB's Special Operations Center, Colonel General Alexander Tikhonov. A chaotic battle broke out as the special forces fought to enter the school. The forces included the assault groups of the FSB and the associated troops of the Russian Army and the Russian Interior Ministry, supported by a number of T-72 tanks from Russia's 58th Army. BTR-80 wheeled armored personnel carriers and armed helicopters, including at least one Mi-24 attack helicopter. Many local civilians also joined in the chaotic battle, Having brought along their own weapons, at least one of the armed volunteers is known to have been killed. At the same time, regular conscripted soldiers reportedly fled the scene as the fighting began. Civilian witnesses claimed that the local police also had panicked, even firing in the wrong direction. At least 3, but as many as 9 powerful Shamil rockets were fired at the school from the positions of the special forces. The use of the Shamil rockets, classified in Russia as flamethrowers and in the West as thermobaric weapons, was initially denied, but later admitted by the government. A report by an aide to the military prosecutor of the North Ossetian garrison stated that rebounds per game 26 rocket-propelled grenades were used as well. The rebels also used grenade launchers, firing at the Russian positions in the apartment buildings. According to military prosecutor, a BTR armored vehicle drove close to the school and opened fire from its 14.5 x 114 mm KPV heavy machine gun at the windows on the second floor. Eyewitnesses and journalists saw 2 T-72 tanks advance on the school that afternoon, at least one of which fired its 125 mm main guns several times. During the later trial, tank commander Viktor Kindiv testified to having fired 1 blank shot and 6 anti-personnel high-explosive shells, on orders from the FSB. The use of tanks and armored personnel carriers was eventually admitted to by Lieutenant General Viktor Sobolev, commander of the 58th Army. Another witness cited in the Basayev report claims that he had jumped onto the turret of a tank in an attempt to prevent it from firing on the school. Scores of hostages were moved by the militants from the burning sports hall into the other parts of the school, in particular the cafeteria, where they were forced to stand at windows. Many of them were shot by troops outside as they were used as human shields, according to the survivors. Savalayev estimated that 106 to 110 hostages died after being moved to the cafeteria. By 1500 hours, 2 hours after the assault began, Russian troops claimed control of most of the school. However, fighting was still continuing on the grounds as evening fell, including resistance from a group of militants holding out in the school's basement. During the battle, a group of some 13 militants broke through the military cordon and took refuge nearby. Several of them were believed to have entered a nearby 2-story building, which was destroyed by tanks and flamethrowers around 2100 hours, according to the Ossetian Committee's findings. Another group of militants appeared to head back over the railway, chased by helicopters into the town. Firefighters, who were called by and drove 2 hours after the fire started, were not prepared to battle the blaze that raged in the gymnasium. One fire truck crew arrived after 2 hours at their own initiative, but with only 200 liters of water and unable to connect to the nearby hydrants. The first water came at 15:28, nearly 2.5 hours after the start of the fire. The second fire engine arrived at 15:43. Few ambulances were available to transport the hundreds of injured victims, who were mostly driven to hospital in private cars. One suspected militant was lynched on the scene by a mob of civilians, an event filmed by the Sky News crew, while an unarmed militant was captured alive by the Oman troops while trying to hide under their truck. Some of the dead insurgents appeared to be mutilated by the commandos. Sporadic explosions and gunfire continued at night despite reports that all resistance by militants had been suppressed, until some 12 hours after the first explosions. Early the next day Putin ordered the borders of North Ossetia closed while some hostage takers were apparently still pursued. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?